when the alien commander Threx proposed a bold new tactic targeting the girlfriend of an Earth Avenger, he thought he had found humanity's greatest weakness, their emotional connections. But what began as a calculated experiment to expose their vulnerabilities spiraled into a catastrophic clash of wills, ingenuity, and defiance. As the Xandorian warship closes in on its prey, neither Threx nor his general realizes that they've underestimated not just a lone Avenger's determination but the resilience of the human spirit itself. What happens when the hunter becomes the hunted, and the bonds of love prove more powerful than alien technology? In the cold vastness of space, the Xandorian flagship Eclipser hovered above the shadowed side of Earth, its cloaking systems rendering it invisible to the primitive sensors of the humans below. Inside the massive vessel, Commander Threx stood at the apex of a sleek observation deck, his multifaceted eyes fixed on a holographic projection of Earth. To the Xandorian military, Earth was an anomaly, its inhabitants primitive by most standards, yet they consistently defied expectations. For centuries, the Xandorian Empire had dominated countless worlds, conquering them through brute force and superior technology. Yet, when they turned their attention to Earth, they encountered a level of resistance that bordered on absurdity. Despite their lack of advanced weaponry, humans possessed an uncanny ability to adapt, improvise, and overcome, often emerging victorious in ways that defied logic. Their defenders, the so-called Avenger-class warriors, were particularly troublesome, each representing a unique blend of strength, cunning, and emotional intensity. Commander Threx had studied these warriors extensively, fascinated by the driving force behind their actions. What set them apart wasn't their physical abilities, though formidable, but the profound emotional connections they shared with others. Bonds of loyalty, friendship, and love seemed to fuel their strength, propelling them to feats that surpassed even their natural limits. Threx had a theory: the human's greatest strength could also be their most exploitable weakness. His theory was met with skepticism from General Ulrichs, a seasoned leader who valued brute force over cunning. The general saw no need for intricate plans when their fleet could obliterate entire continents in a single strike. But Threx argued that outright destruction would yield no valuable data. If the Xandorians wanted to understand the phenomenon of humanity's resilience, they needed a subtler approach. Threx proposed a bold experiment. Instead of confronting the Avenger-class warriors directly, they would target one of their emotional connections, a loved one. By manipulating and observing the response, they could uncover the psychological mechanisms that drove these humans to such extremes. After thorough analysis, Threx identified the ideal target, Elise Carter. Elise was an astrophysicist, remarkable in her field but unremarkable in every other way. She lived a quiet life, largely removed from the chaos of Earth's battles, and had only one notable connection: her relationship with one of the planet's most formidable defenders. Threx reasoned that by abducting her, they could provoke the Avenger into reckless actions, exposing vulnerabilities that could be exploited on a larger scale. General Ulrichs approved the plan, though more out of curiosity than conviction. The operation commenced with precision. Under cover of night, an abduction beam enveloped Elise's home, leaving no trace of her existence behind. The Xandorian scientists immediately began their work, not through invasive procedures, but through an exhaustive study of her behavior, thoughts, and emotions. As Elise was brought aboard the Eclipser, unaware of the monumental experiment in which she had become a pawn, the Xandorians celebrated the apparent success of their plan. Yet in their arrogance, they overlooked one critical factor: humanity's unpredictable nature. What they considered a weakness would soon prove to be their undoing. Elise Carter awoke to disorienting cold, her surroundings unfamiliar. Her head throbbed as she tried to focus, but everything around her was shrouded in a soft, blue haze. She instinctively reached for her phone, expecting to check for any messages or notifications, but found nothing. Her hands were empty. Panic surged briefly in her chest before her logical mind began to take control. Something had happened. Something unnatural. The last thing she remembered was stepping out of her house to take a walk beneath the stars. But that memory seemed like it belonged to someone else, far removed from this moment. She wasn't in her cozy living room anymore, nor was she outdoors. The place she found herself in was clinical, alien, its walls a smooth, metallic surface that glowed with an eerie, unearthly light. There were no windows, no doors that she could see, just faint hums of technology she couldn't recognize. Her first thought was that she had been abducted, though she had no proof. Fear tightened her chest, but it was quickly replaced by an intense surge of curiosity. This wasn't the first time she'd heard of strange occurrences, of people vanishing without a trace, of alien conspiracies whispered about by those who dared question the world's mundane reality. Yet never in her wildest dreams had she thought she would be part of one of those stories. Her breath came out in shallow bursts, but she steadied herself. There had to be a reason for all of this. Her logical mind couldn't accept the alternative. She pushed herself off the cold, metallic surface beneath her, standing tall and scanning the strange environment. Then she noticed something else. The subtle humming of technology surrounding her wasn't just noise, it was something else. A presence. Something or someone watching her. Her heart skipped a beat. As if in response to her awareness, a series of soft lights flickered to life in the ceiling above her, revealing an intricate network of sensors, surveillance cameras, and devices she had no name for. She wasn't just in any kind of holding cell, she was in an experimental chamber of some sort, and they were watching her. Not just her physical movements, but her mind as well. She could feel it, the invasive sensation of being monitored, not just by machines, but by something more. It didn't take long for Elise to realize that she wasn't alone. Invisible to her at first, the presence of others began to become undeniable. She saw faint shapes flicker in the edges of her peripheral vision, movements too swift to track, but they were there. The air around her felt thick, charged with an unnatural energy. She wasn't just a prisoner, she was a specimen. She drew a sharp breath and tried to steady herself. This wasn't the first time she'd been put to the test. She was a scientist, a problem solver. She could adapt, just as she had done throughout her career. Still, as her mind raced, she couldn't help but wonder what they wanted from her. She wasn't the hero of some great cosmic battle. She was just a scientist, an ordinary person in an extraordinary situation. She was supposed to be a pawn in someone else's game, but she refused to believe that would be her end. A new realization crept into her mind. Whoever had brought her here, they were watching closely. Every movement, every decision was being analyzed. It dawned on her that her captors weren't simply interested in her knowledge. They were studying her emotions, her reactions. They wanted to understand her, a person, not a prisoner, and that meant they were trying to understand humans as a whole. This wasn't just an abduction. This was a test. Elise wasn't sure if it was the isolation, the helplessness, or the crushing uncertainty that made the situation feel so surreal. But in that moment, she realized something else. She had to survive. She wasn't just a pawn in their game. If they wanted to learn about humanity, they'd have to learn it the hard way through her. Back on Earth, the disappearance of Elise Carter sent ripples through the world's security networks. Her sudden vanishing was odd enough, but when it became clear that it wasn't just a case of abduction by human hands, the world's most powerful defenders took notice. At first, the Avengers were skeptical, dismissing the event as an isolated anomaly. But then they saw the evidence: strange atmospheric distortions, erratic shifts in energy signatures that seemed to point to advanced technology far beyond anything known to Earth. That's when they knew it wasn't just an abduction. Someone had taken her, someone far more powerful than they could have imagined. The Avenger tasked with finding Elise, a figure known for his intellect and unparalleled skill in tracking, took immediate action. His ship, though modest compared to the Xandorian fleet, was equipped with technology that made it agile and capable of slipping past even the most sophisticated enemy defenses. Using a combination of his own tech and human ingenuity, he traced the faint energy signatures left by the abduction beam, meticulously following the irregularities as they became more pronounced. But he was up against more than just an advanced alien fleet. He was up against the very thing that made Earth's defenders so formidable: their unyielding will. The Avenger wasn't driven by the need for glory or even by a sense of duty. He was driven by something much deeper: the emotional connection to a woman who had no idea that her life had been turned upside down in the blink of an eye. The stakes weren't just strategic, they were personal. As the Avenger's ship tore through space, maneuvering around asteroids and weaving through gravitational anomalies, the Xandorians were already aware of his pursuit. They had been monitoring Earth's systems long enough to recognize the patterns of their defenders, and they knew this wouldn't be an easy battle. Threx, the Xandorian commander, had anticipated resistance, but he had underestimated the lengths to which the humans would go to protect one of their own. His initial assessment of Earth's emotional fragility now seemed dangerously flawed. The Xandorian fleet, though vast and powerful, was not built for subtlety. Their ships were formidable, but they lacked the nimbleness and adaptability of the Avengers' vessel. Threx had prepared to intercept any intruder, but he wasn't ready for the relentless persistence of this lone human warrior. As the Avengers slipped through the outer patrols, evading detection with surgical precision, the Xandorians scrambled to contain the situation. They sent out decoy signals, attempting to mislead him into traps, but each attempt failed. The Avengers' ship, honed by years of human ingenuity and battle experience, outmaneuvered their most sophisticated countermeasures. Elise, unaware of the growing war just beyond the walls of her alien prison, remained under constant observation. Every moment of her captivity was monitored, her reactions to the smallest stimuli recorded, analyzed, and stored. But as time passed, something began to change. She adapted. She began noticing the inconsistencies in her confinement, small, subtle flaws in the system. The surveillance devices weren't infallible. She found tools hidden within reach that could be used to her advantage. What had started as a passive study of a human had begun to shift into something far more complex. The Xandorians were so focused on their experiment that they failed to realize how Elise's resourcefulness and the growing determination of the Avenger would set in motion a chain of events neither side could control. As the Avenger inched closer to his goal, Threx's calculated plan to break humanity's spirit began to unravel in ways he could not have foreseen. The chase was no longer just a battle for survival. It had become a battle for control of the narrative itself. And with every step, Elise and her would-be rescuer were writing a story of their own, one the Xandorians would soon regret underestimating. Elise had always been a quick thinker, a trait that had served her well in her career as an astrophysicist. But now, in the silent, clinical chamber aboard the Xandorian ship, she was forced to apply that same logic and creativity to her survival. Days, maybe weeks, had passed since her abduction, and still she had no idea why she was here or who her captors truly were. All she knew was that they were not human. The technology around her, the strange humming machinery, the cold metallic walls, none of it was anything she recognized. She had no idea if anyone on Earth even knew she was missing. She could only assume that her disappearance had triggered a response from her world's defenders, but there was no telling how long that might take. At first, Elise's captivity had been terrifying. She had tried everything to escape, from searching for hidden exits to testing every inch of the walls for weaknesses. But it soon became clear that none of her initial efforts would work. The room was impenetrable. Yet, as the days dragged on, her mind began to shift. There were cracks, small ones that she hadn't noticed before. The surveillance system, for example, the cameras that monitored her every movement had once seemed omnipresent, their tiny glowing red lights never leaving her side. But now she noticed that they occasionally blinked out, leaving her alone for seconds at a time. Those seconds were precious. Slowly, methodically, Elise began to collect what little she could. A loose panel in the floor, a misplaced wire. She wasn't sure what she would do with them yet, but they gave her a sense of agency in an otherwise powerless situation. The more she observed, the more she learned about her captors, not just their technology, but their psychology. They were not the infallible, omnipotent beings they'd appeared to be. Their systems had flaws, their methods were imperfect, and they were arrogant. They thought they could break her. They thought that by studying her emotions, her thoughts, they could predict how she would react, that they could harness something within her to break humanity itself. But Elise knew something they didn't. Humans didn't break easily. As time passed, she began to test the limits of her imprisonment. Her emotional reactions were monitored relentlessly, and every time she exhibited fear, anger, or confusion, the Xandorians seemed to take notes, analyzing her response. But she was careful not to give them what they wanted. She began to play along with their expectations, behaving predictably to keep them thinking they had control. All the while, she was secretly undermining their systems, exploiting their overconfidence. They had underestimated her, and in doing so, they had allowed her small victories to slip through their fingers. Meanwhile, back on Earth, the Avengers were closing in on the location of the Xandorian ship. Elise had no way of knowing when or if her rescuers would come, but the thought of them alone Avengers somewhere in the stars, hunting for her, gave her the strength to keep fighting, even when it felt like hope was slipping away. What she didn't realize, however, was that her actions aboard the ship were not going unnoticed. Threx, the Xandorian commander, had been impressed by the resilience of Elise, but his admiration had begun to shift into something darker. Every time he watched her outsmart his systems, every time she slipped past his traps, he began to see her not as an experiment but as a threat. He thought that by isolating her he could break the human spirit, but instead she was evolving, adapting, learning in ways his people hadn't predicted. Elise was becoming the very thing he feared most: unpredictable. It wasn't just her resourcefulness that worried him, it was her determination. She wasn't a subject to be studied. She wasn't a pawn in their game. She was a force of nature, an embodiment of humanity's most dangerous weapon, resilience. And with each passing day, Threx realized that the real test wasn't whether humans could be broken, it was whether they could be underestimated at all. As days turned into weeks aboard the Eclipser, Elise's sense of time became distorted. Her life had been reduced to a series of small, calculated actions in a cold, unfamiliar space. Each day, she woke with the same purpose: survival. She no longer cared about the reasons behind her abduction. Those answers, if they ever came, were secondary. What mattered now was proving that the Xandorians had made a grave mistake by underestimating her, and by extension, humanity. She had no way of knowing if the Avengers were still searching for her, or if they had even realized she was taken. But somewhere deep inside, Elise trusted that they wouldn't give up. Her mind often wandered to thoughts of the Avenger who would be coming for her, the one who, just as determined as she was, would stop at nothing to find her. It was the hope of seeing him again that kept her pushing forward. Meanwhile, the Xandorian scientists, under Threx's orders, continued their study. They believed that they had reached the pinnacle of understanding human psychology, but Elise was far more complex than they anticipated. Her resilience was something they couldn't quantify, a variable they couldn't control. Every time they thought they had her figured out, she would show them something new. She was learning from them just as they were learning from her, using their technology and their strategies against them in ways they never imagined. On the surface, it seemed like a stalemate. Elise trapped, the Xandorians confident that they could break her. But beneath it all, she was growing stronger. The Xandorians had focused too much on her physical containment and emotional reactions, but they hadn't considered the one thing they could never measure: the strength of the human will. One day, as Elise sat in her cell, her mind racing through possible escape strategies, she noticed something different. The sensors that had always monitored her seemed less vigilant. The lights that had once flickered incessantly now pulsed in a rhythmic pattern. She had no idea why, but it became clear that something had changed in the ship's systems. It was as if the Xandorians had grown complacent. Maybe they thought they had broken her by now. Maybe they thought she had surrendered. But she hadn't. Elise's mind immediately began to process the new opportunity. She had spent weeks observing every small detail of her confinement, learning how the systems worked, when they malfunctioned, and how they could be bypassed. Now she knew what she had to do. Her plan had to be executed quickly, with precision. She couldn't afford to make any mistakes. She started with the surveillance system, which was the most reliable of the Xandorians' technologies. With a few small, hidden tools she had crafted from discarded materials, she was able to manipulate the controls, distorting the signals that allowed the Xandorians to track her movements. The cameras flickered, as if unsure of what was happening. That was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment of vulnerability. Her heart raced as she moved quickly, silently. She knew she had only minutes, maybe less, before they realized something was wrong. Elise didn't wait to see if the system would fail entirely. She took immediate action, using the chaos in the system to slip through a small maintenance hatch she had previously discovered. It wasn't much, just a narrow tunnel, barely wide enough to crawl through, but it was enough. She moved swiftly, determined to get as far away as possible before the Xandorians regained control. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't go back. The deeper she went into the ship's corridors, the more disoriented she became. But the drive to escape pushed her forward. Every step felt like a victory, every new twist and turn a small defiance against her captors. Meanwhile, Threx was growing more agitated. He could sense that something was wrong, but he couldn't pinpoint what it was. He watched the reports coming in from his monitoring systems, increasingly disturbed by the irregularities. The more he studied Elise, the more he realized that she wasn't just any human. She was something else entirely, a symbol of everything the Xandorian Empire had failed to comprehend about humanity. And now, she was slipping away from them. Elise's flight through the Eclipser wasn't just a physical escape, it was a triumph of human ingenuity over the cold logic of alien invaders. She wasn't simply running. She was proving to herself and to them that they had failed. And no matter how advanced their technology or how calculated their plans, they would never understand the depth of human resolve. The deeper Elise ventured into the bowels of the Eclipser, the more the ship seemed to close in on her. The corridors grew narrower, twisting in unfamiliar angles, and the air turned colder with each step. Her heart beat in her chest, but her resolve remained unshaken. She had made it this far, and she wasn't going to let the Xandorians catch her now. She knew they would be searching for her, scrambling to regain control of the system she had corrupted. But for the moment, she was free, or at least as free as one could be on an alien warship. Her mind raced as she navigated through the labyrinthine halls. She had no map, no idea where she was headed. All she knew was that she had to keep moving. She had always been a scientist, a problem solver, and this was no different. She analyzed each step, each movement, knowing that her survival depended on how quickly she could think and adapt. The Xandorians might have superior technology, but she had something they lacked: human creativity and the ability to make impossible decisions on the fly. Eventually, she stumbled upon a large control room, its walls lined with alien consoles, their screens glowing with strange symbols she didn't understand. But she didn't need to understand them. What she needed was access to the ship's systems to control, or at least disrupt, the functions that would allow her to evade capture. Her fingers moved with practiced precision, manipulating the alien interface with a confidence she didn't feel. She wasn't entirely sure what she was doing, but she knew she had to make the most of this opportunity. As her hands danced over the controls, the ship's systems flickered. Lights dimmed and brightened erratically, and the hum of the ship's engine seemed to slow and speed up in a disorienting rhythm. Elise's heart skipped a beat. Had she made a mistake? Was she about to expose herself to a more aggressive response from the Xandorians? But she pushed the panic aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. She couldn't afford to hesitate. Suddenly, the door to the control room slammed open, and Elise's breath caught in her throat. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the dim light of the corridor, was a Xandorian soldier, their eyes glowing with cold indifference. It was too late to run, and she knew that if she were caught now, she might never get another chance. But Elise didn't freeze. She moved quickly, instinctively grabbing a metal rod from the nearest console and hurling it at the soldier. It struck him with surprising force, causing him to stumble back in shock. Elise didn't wait for him to recover. She darted toward a nearby hatch and slipped through it just as the soldier regained his composure and shouted for reinforcements. The hatch closed behind her with a resounding clang, and she found herself in another narrow hallway. This time, she didn't look back. She ran with everything she had, her heart pounding in her chest as she heard the footsteps of the Xandorian soldiers echoing behind her. She could hear their commands being shouted, their boots pounding on the metal floors as they closed in. But Elise didn't slow down. The adrenaline was flooding her system, pushing her forward even as her body screamed for rest. Through a series of twists and turns, she reached the outer docking bay. The area was heavily guarded, but it was her only chance. She knew the ship had to have some kind of escape pod, something that would allow her to leave in case of an emergency. She had to find it before they found her. She moved stealthily, keeping to the shadows, her eyes scanning the room for anything that might offer an escape. Her fingers brushed against a console, and she hesitated. This was it. The moment she had been waiting for, the final piece of the puzzle. She tapped the screen quickly, hoping the systems were still disrupted enough to grant her access. The console flickered for a moment, then came to life. A door slid open to reveal a small, sleek craft nestled in the bay. Elise didn't think twice. She rushed toward it, her legs aching, her breath ragged. She had no time to waste. Every second counted. She climbed into the pod, locking the hatch behind her with a sharp click. For the first time since her abduction, she felt a glimmer of hope. She was almost free. But as she initiated the launch sequence, a deep, menacing voice echoed through the ship's speakers. "You cannot escape." Threx's voice. His cold, calculating tone sent a shiver down her spine, but she didn't hesitate. She pressed the button, and the pod's engines roared to life. The docking bay doors began to close, but Elise was already moving faster than they could react. As the pod shot out into the vast emptiness of space, Elise finally allowed herself a moment to breathe. She was free, at least for now, but she knew the Xandorians wouldn't stop hunting her. They had underestimated her once, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. The real fight was just beginning. The cold expanse of space stretched out before Elise as she navigated the escape pod through the Xandorian fleet. Her hands were still trembling from the adrenaline, but she forced herself to focus. She couldn't let her guard down, not now. The Eclipser was still out there, and though she had managed to escape its clutches, she knew the Xandorians would be relentless in their pursuit. Their commander, Threx, would stop at nothing to recapture her and punish her defiance. But Elise had something he hadn't counted on: an unbreakable resolve. As the pod hurtled through the void, she kept her eyes trained on the control panel, scanning for any signs of incoming ships. She was flying blind, relying on instinct and what little information she had been able to gather during her time on the Xandorian ship. She knew she couldn't head straight for Earth, not yet. The Xandorians would be waiting for her there, and any approach would likely be intercepted. She needed to find a way to throw them off her trail, to gain some distance before making her way home. She rerouted the pod's course toward an uncharted sector of space, a region of dense nebulae and black holes where navigation was treacherous and unpredictable. The kind of place where even advanced Xandorian technology would have trouble tracking her. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was her best shot. The pod's small, flickering screens showed the immense distances she was covering, but they also indicated how much time and fuel she had left. Her heart sank when she saw the fuel level. She wasn't sure she had enough to reach Earth from here. Her only hope was to survive long enough to find a safe place to replenish, a refuge where she could lie low and regroup. Meanwhile, back in the Xandorian command ship, Threx was seething with anger. Elise's escape had been a humiliating failure for his fleet, and he knew the humans were capable of far more than he had initially realized. It was one thing to defeat them in battle, but to be outwitted by a single human female, it was a blow to his pride that he could not ignore. His mind raced, calculating his next move. He needed to ensure that this would not happen again. He sent out a series of encrypted commands to the Xandorian ships under his command, ordering them to form a blockade in the sector Elise had fled to. They wouldn't let her slip through again. But as he issued the orders, a small seed of doubt began to grow. Elise had shown herself to be unpredictable, and that was a trait that made her dangerous. Perhaps, just perhaps, underestimating humanity had been his greatest mistake. Elise's thoughts, on the other hand, were focused entirely on surviving. She couldn't afford to get complacent. As she adjusted the pod's course and avoided debris in the vast stretches of space, her mind kept racing over everything that had led up to this moment. The Xandorians had tried to break her, but they had failed. They had underestimated human determination, human ingenuity. They had learned nothing about Earth, nothing about its people. But Elise knew they wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Her pod's proximity alarm suddenly blared, snapping her out of her thoughts. She scanned the readings quickly. Several ships were closing in on her, moving faster than anything she could outrun. The Xandorians had found her. Her pulse quickened, but she didn't panic. She activated the pod's cloaking mechanism, hoping it would be enough to buy her some time. She immediately cut all unnecessary systems, conserving power as much as possible. She would need every last bit of energy to evade detection. As she drifted silently through the nebula, the space around her became a chaotic mix of gas clouds and shimmering starlight, a perfect hiding place, or at least, she hoped it would be. The pursuing ships moved into the sector, their sensors scanning the area for any sign of her presence. They were too focused on their own search to notice the faint energy signatures of the cloaked pod. Elise held her breath, praying that the cloaking system would hold just long enough. As the ships passed by, barely 100 meters from her, Elise felt a momentary sense of triumph. She had done it, she had escaped their grasp, at least for now, but she knew it wouldn't last long. Thrax was cunning, and he would be relentless. Her fight for survival wasn't over. She couldn't let herself grow complacent. With a deep breath, Elise turned her attention back to the control panel. It was time to keep moving, to find her way back to Earth. She didn't know what awaited her there, but she knew one thing for certain: humanity would never back down. They were stronger than the Xandorians had realized, and as long as she was alive, she would keep fighting, keep outsmarting them, until the day they were defeated for good. The chase was far from over, but for the first time since her abduction, Elise believed she might just be able to win. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Sci-Fi Horizons Stories for more thrilling tales of science fiction and adventure. Stay tuned, because in the vast unknown of space, there's always another twist waiting to keep you on the edge of your seat.